The Wind by Helen. He was dressed inconspicuously, a lit cigarette in his hand, and the lingering taste of bad coffee and indignation in his mouth. "You win some, you lose some," he said to himself, without conviction. In spite of his intention to forget the whole thing, to write it off as a bad lot, fragments of the previous day's debacle would keep coming back to him. Mainly he remembered Hetty's father, a solid, patrician-looking man upholstered in a dark pinstripe, saying, "Your name isn't even Martin Sloane. I've checked. You must be mad if you thought I wouldn't, considering what Hetty is worth." And Hetty not looking at him. She'd sat there, in the peach silk dress that had cost a ridiculous amount of money, and suited her so badly, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She'd looked at her father, out of the window, down at the table, anywhere but at Martin. That was when he'd known. It was all up. He'd made a half-hearted attempt to say that Hetty's wealth was an irrelevance, that he adored her for herself, but that had been mostly face-saving. Shortly afterwards he'd risen from the table, making a great display of dudgeon, and stalked out of the restaurant, being sure to leave Hetty's father with the bill. It was very hard not to feel aggrieved. He'd invested a considerable amount of time in the whole affair, not to mention the cost of flowers and chocolate, and the ring, which was set with cubic zirconia rather than diamonds, as he'd claimed, but which had still required a decent outlay. And after all, Hetty, who was pale and somehow rather watery, would have had Martin's good looks and charm in return, at least for a while, and some useful life experience to boot. But now here he was, walking down the West High Street with a bitter little pucker at the corner of his mouth and £20 to his name. It was perhaps the need to find a new project to fill the gap precipitously left by Hetty that made him more receptive than usual to his surroundings. He'd walked down this street a great many times before, after all, but generally he'd been preoccupied with this and that. Today he was scanning the scene, as if literally looking for the main chance. What snagged his gaze first was a glowing seam between two very tall buildings, one a nondescript grey apartment building, the other a grimy set of disused offices, also grey, the sort of places the eye normally slid past from lack of interest. The strip of light was so bright that for a moment his brain interpreted it as neon, and Martin felt a brief spark of surprise at the incongruity of it. Then it faded, and he realized that what he'd seen was a narrow gap between the buildings, brilliantly illuminated by a serendipitous shaft of sunshine. Without it, the gap was barely noticeable. Martin shot a swift glance over his shoulder, the habitual action of those who wish to avoid observation, and then he wandered nonchalantly over to take a closer look. It was a curious sort of gap, not wide enough to be considered a thoroughfare, but not so narrow that you couldn't go down it at all, though you might have to turn sideways. It was unclear why the builders had bothered to leave a gap at all, since it was so awkward to traverse and an inviting repository for rubbish. He'd have lost interest then, except he glanced up and saw that there was a street name sign high up on the left-hand wall, very much faded and worn, so that the words were hardly legible. The first one he couldn't make out at all, though the final letter might have been a K. The second one was Wind, W-Y-N-D. In addition to a lately acquired name, Martin had a plummy Southern English accent, which was very different from the one he'd grown up with. As a child he'd often run through city alleys marked Wind or Vennel, not infrequently clutching someone else's property in his grubby hands. He didn't recall ever seeing such passages described as wines since he'd moved south. Well, none of this was going to restore his failing fortunes. He thought he'd better get on, go to the barber perhaps, and refresh his style a little. After that he might haunt an upmarket coffee shop or wine bar for a while, and scope the place out for a replacement for Hetty. He stepped forward, and then, all of a sudden, he had a view right down the Wind to the end. It was light down there. Clearly the Wind opened out into a courtyard, or perhaps another street, and he could see a vertical strip of building. That it was a church was obvious from the pointed window arches and the profusion of carved detailing on the facade. No house or office block ever looked like that. The sun came out again, and suddenly it blazed gold in a myriad of places where the carving was adorned with gold leaf. Martin froze, looking. He did not consciously say to himself, "There are valuables here, ripe for the picking." It was a very long time since he pilfered lead from a church roof or portable items from inside. He had grander ambitions these days. But he felt the siren song of ill-guarded opulence, and given that he had nothing else in particular to do, the decision to just go and have a look was swiftly made. When he tried to enter the wind, he discovered that it really did require him to turn sideways on. A span of his shoulders would not fit into its width. If he'd been any stouter, he might not have managed it that way either. As it was, his chest was almost touching the grimy stone wall. "Good thing I'm not claustrophobic," he said to himself as he inched his way down the wind, persuading himself, as much as anything, to keep tiny prickles of alarm at bay. The air was faintly damp in here, and mineral-smelling, and sound was magnified, so that the shuffling of his shoes on the ground and even his own breathing were loud in his ears. Halfway down it occurred to him that there must be another way to the church. It couldn't possibly only be accessed through this unnervingly narrow space. But he was committed now. He went on, feeling as though he should be extruded from the end, like toothpaste from the tube. At last he approached the end of the wind, and the magnificence of the church's facade opened out in front of him, the gilding gleaming in the shafts of sunlight. It was very tall, its Gothic pinnacles at least as high as the tops of the surrounding buildings, and very highly ornate, textured all over with finely chiselled figures and motifs. Martin was not an expert in church architecture, his interest in such places being entirely commercial, but even to his untrained eye it looked very odd. He looked about him, and found that he was in a very small court with stone flags underfoot. The church took up one side of it, and the other 3 sides, with the exception of the slit through which he'd passed, were made up of high blank walls. There were no windows, no doors, no fire escapes or ladders, simply dark grey stone walls, as though all the surrounding buildings had turned their backs. All the sides were so high that if the sun hadn't been directly overhead, the entire court would have been sunk in shadow. Most probably that was why he'd never noticed the wind before. He'd never passed at exactly the right time. The church had a heavy oak door with black iron strap hinges, and that was curious because it implied that people would go in and out the way Martin had, through the wind, which seemed very inconvenient. Presumably access had been freer when the church was constructed, and it had been built around later. He supposed there was another door, one leading out into the street on the other side. Martin looked back down the wind. At the far end, beyond the close-set walls, he could see the street he'd left, light, modern, reassuringly dull. Nobody was passing. He turned his back and went over to the church door, putting out his hand for the handle. To his surprise, it wasn't locked. It opened easily. Martin stepped inside, feeling a subtle change in the air temperature. Out in the court it was cool, even a little damp, but inside the church it was dry and rather warm. He was assailed by a lot of different impressions, not only the warmth, but the sound of his feet on the stone floor, and the aromas of furniture polish, dust, and incense. Light tinted many different colours, dappled the flagstones and the heavy oak pews. There were, he saw, stained glass windows set into each of the walls, which was unexpected. He'd thought the sides directly adjoined other buildings, but no, the church must be surrounded by open space. He didn't recall seeing a church on the scale of this one in the area. Even if you weren't interested in ecclesiastical buildings, you could hardly miss one this size. But, seemingly, he had. Disappointingly, there was nothing that was movable. There were plenty of exquisite little carvings of fruit and flowers, animals and figures, but all of them were integral to the heavy oak pews, the pulpit, and the lectern. There were brasses on the floor, mere shapes of people, so worn that he could not make out any recognizable feature, but they were flush to the flagstones, and he soon abandoned his half-hearted attempts to prise one of them up. Then he looked around for chalices, crucifixes, and candlesticks, but there were none, save a large cross suspended over the altar, which was too big to be of interest and out of reach anyway. He had now, rather unwillingly, examined almost everything in the church. The entire enterprise was depressing. There was nothing he could surreptitiously remove, and it simply reminded him of what might have been. Himself and Hetty standing before the altar, she simpering as he pledged undying fealty to her and, more importantly, her money. He thought about that money with something akin to lust, but he knew that it was useless. Hetty's father had seen to that. Martin decided to leave. He was wasting time here. There might be some plump widow with a huge annuity, nursing a mojito all on her own in the chic little bar round the corner. Onwards and upwards, he thought. He cast a last eye around, and it was then that he noticed the stained glass windows. He'd been aware of them before, of course, but he hadn't really looked at them because they didn't offer any kind of opportunity to such a one as himself. They couldn't be carried away and sold. All but one of the windows, he thought there were about 12, were of the most higgledy-piggledy appearance. Martin seemed to recall that glass from windows which had been smashed, for historical reasons quite obscure to him, was sometimes reinserted in fragmentary fashion. Why anyone would do this was equally obscure. The effect was chaotic. Here he saw a hand pointing, there a fold of drapery, and below that a section of pattern he couldn't identify at all. It was impossible to guess what that window, or any of the others, had originally represented. It had people or a person in it, that was pretty clear, but you couldn't tell what they'd been doing, or even if it was a man or a woman. The light positively glowed through the glass, warm and peachy, and he supposed the glazing must have some kind of tint to it. It made a glittering mosaic, an incomprehensible beauty of all the tiny fragments. All the windows were like that, but one. Naturally, Martin's eye was drawn to it, and to the figure which dominated it. It was a curious image for a religious setting, not a crucifixion or ascension, nor a nativity, but a man seemingly climbing out of a window, bent under the weight of a sack he carried on his shoulders. A thief, thought Martin. It was wonderfully well done. The architectural detailing of the window and the wall that framed it suggested affluence. There were little crenellations running across the top and fluted pilasters to either side. The figure wore a flowing green tunic and yellow hose, and there was an evil-looking short sword attached at his waist. His hands supported the bulging bag on his shoulders, and his face was turned to the viewer. Martin felt an unpleasant thrill of recognition. The face was remarkably like his own. He'd been meaning to go, but now he couldn't help himself. He went over to take a closer look. The resemblance was striking, although the painted face in the glass was somehow tainted with dishonesty. It was handsome, framed with thick fair hair, but it was a false, gloating face, the eyes sharp and furtive. He prided himself on the fact that, whatever faults he had, they were walled up with a pleasing exterior, and he didn't like to see them displayed like this. The likeness must have been coincidental, but Martin felt an irrational flash of anger, as though the artist had purposely caricatured him. The more he stared at it, the more the features seemed to leer down at him. He stepped back, still staring angrily at the window, and then he saw there were words underneath the figure, a motto or quotation of some kind, written in spiky Gothic script. With a little effort he read, "Ye shall not steal, neither deal falsely, neither lie to one another," and after it, Leviticus 19:11. So the figure was indeed a thief, and now Martin saw that he was also a deceiver. Behind him, framed in the corner of the window, was a woman in a scarlet kirtle, her long hair loose and her face turned aside in shame. Martin thought of Hetty, quite involuntarily. Generally he felt no guilt at all, since the world was a hard place and a man had to live. Now he felt obscurely that he was being attacked, and that made him first angry again, and then defensive. Women weren't ruined any more these days. Hetty had had her fun too, he'd seen to that, and it wasn't as though he'd ruined her prospects or anything so Victorian. The window was a piece of outdated and, quite frankly, offensive morality. If he'd thrown a brick through it, he'd have done the world a favour. He turned his back at last and went over to the heavy oak door, thinking of the street outside and the chic little bar round the corner, once he'd negotiated the gloomy length of the wind. So concentrated was he on this pleasing idea that it took him a moment to react to the fact that the door wouldn't open. He pushed the iron handle down, and nothing happened. Then he leant a brawny shoulder against the oak and shoved. The door didn't move. There wasn't so much as a tremor. Martin leant on the handle hard, pressing it down, thinking that perhaps he simply hadn't depressed it far enough. Then he pulled back and thumped it with his shoulder. It still didn't give. Was it possible that someone had come and locked it from the outside without his hearing them? It seemed unlikely. Martin stopped and examined the door, but he couldn't actually see a lock at all. There was just the ineffectual handle. After giving the door a couple of stout kicks, he gave up and went to look for the other door out. There wasn't one. He made a complete tour of the church, following the walls, going into every corner, and feeling with his hands where the shadows were too deep to see properly. After 5 minutes of fruitless searching, he concluded that there was no second door. There was the one which led out to the wynd, and no other. Martin stood in the middle of the nave and put a hand to his head, considering. It seemed incredible that the only entrance and exit to such a grandiose building should be through that narrow wynd. There must be a second door. He must simply have missed it. It might be somehow superficially concealed. He went around the church again, and this time he never let his fingertips leave the wall, thinking to find a rim or crack or change in texture. Still nothing. There was solid stone all the way round except for the oak door he'd come in by. He gave a small, incredulous laugh. Then he tried the door again. It was immovable. Martin sat down on an oak pew with a grinning, horned face carved into the end and took out his phone. Whom could he call? The list of saved contacts was lamentably short. Hetty, he wondered, and immediately dismissed the idea. He might have prevailed on her alone to come and rescue him, whatever his sins, but he was pretty sure her father wouldn't countenance it. If he heard that Martin was trapped inside a church, with nothing to amuse himself with except a stained glass window representing dishonesty, he'd probably think it served him right. It would have to be the police then. No doubt they'd be annoyed, but he'd blame it on whoever owned the church. He entered the number. Nothing. No signal. Martin thought about the toweringly high wall surrounding the entrance to the church. Was it possible that there was no reception because of those? It seemed unlikely. I'm in the middle of a bloody city, he said to himself. The stirrings of anger that he'd felt at the image of the thief were slowly inching him to the limits of his control. It was warm in here, warm and dry. If he was stuck here for any length of time, his tongue would soon be hanging out. He remembered the restaurant, and Hetty's father in his expensive suit glaring at him. The carafe of mineral water on the table, crystal clear, glittering in the sunshine. In his memory, everything seemed plump and moist, bursting with water. The little pats of butter in a dish, the fat blossoms on the table. "God damn it," said Martin aloud. He got up again and paced about. He loosened his collar. It was too warm, hot even. He couldn't get out. The thief in the stained glass window smirked down at him with his own features. His face. It was an insult. Martin ground his teeth. He couldn't get out. He couldn't... At last the anger boiled over. There was nothing movable in the church, that was true, but he had his phone in his hand. With a howl of fury, he flung it at the stained glass window as hard as he could, thinking to punch a hole in the middle of it. With a crash like a wave breaking, the entire window erupted, bursting into thousands of tiny, bright, razor-sharp shards that arced through the air with deadly force like a swarm of shrieking insects. Glittering fragments blasted into Martin, through Martin with the force of a hurricane. He didn't even have time to scream before he was engulfed in a perfect blizzard of flying glass. Mere seconds later, the last pieces pattered down onto the flagstones around him, with a series of tiny pops and cracks. Then there was a very long silence. The day slid past. The shadows lengthened and deepened. Inside the church, nothing moved. Nobody came to investigate the sounds, the signs of damage. The oak door stood closed. Outside, the little courtyard became a black pit that smelled vaguely of damp stone. The wynd itself, entirely unlit, became imperceptible. The walls were so close that they seemed to press together. A person might have walked past it 100 times and never noticed it. Hetty did walk past it the next day. She was tear-stained, clutching a balled-up handkerchief in her left hand, but resolute. If she could find Martin, whom she imagined in a bar, gazing miserably into a large Scotch, she meant to defy her father and give him another chance. She said to herself that she was over 30. It was up to her what she did with herself and her money. The wynd did not even penetrate her consciousness. She walked past it, as if it weren't there at all. Beyond the wynd, the church stood silent and self-contained in the slender shaft of sunlight that descended to the little court. The oak door was still closed. Within, if there'd been anyone to smell it, there was a faint aroma of furniture polish, incense, and dust. In front of the rows of heavy pews with their ornate carvings, the stone flagstones lay cool and clear and clean. A warm, gentle light streamed through the 12 stained glass windows. They were curious, those stained glass windows. Not a single one of them depicted anything you might have recognized. All of them seemed to be composed of the broken pieces of some now untraceable scene, reinserted into the window frames in random fashion. One of them had lately depicted a thief climbing out of a window, a sack slung over his shoulders, although nothing of that design was now discernible. An observer could only have guessed at the original content of the picture from details that could be made out on the fragments. Here, for example, was a triangular shard of yellow hair, rippling realistically. Here was a single eye, rolling as in terror, with the white showing all around the iris. Here fingers closed around what might have looked, to an untrained eye, remarkably like a modern mobile phone. And here, weirdly disembodied among a cluster of unidentifiable shapes and textures, an open mouth, screaming desperately, silently, and forever. The Game of Bear by Helen Grant. Two elderly persons sat reading and smoking in the library of a country house after tea on an afternoon in the Christmas holidays, and outside a number of the children of the house were playing about. They had turned out all the lights and were engaged in the dreadful game of bear, which entails stealthy creepings up and down staircases and along passages, and being leapt upon from doorways, with loud and hideous cries. Such a cry, and an answering scream of great poignancy, were heard just outside the library door. One of the two readers, an uncle of the young things who were disporting themselves there, leapt from his chair and dashed the door open. "I will not have you doing that," he shouted, and his voice was vibrant with real anger. "Do you hear? Stop it at once. I can't stand it. Why can't you find something else?" "What? Well, I don't care. I can't put up with it." "Yes, very well. Go and do it somewhere where I can't hear it." He subsided into a growl and came back to his chair, but his friend saw that his nerves were really on edge, and ventured something sympathetic. "It's all very well," said the uncle, "but I cannot bear that jumping out and screaming. Stupid of me to fly out like that, but I couldn't help it. It reminded me of all that business, you know." "Well," said the friend after a short pause, "I'm really not sure that I do. Oh, he added, in a more concerned one, "unless you mean Purdue?" "That's it," said the uncle. There was another silence, and then the friend said, "Really, I'm not sorry that happened just now, for I never did hear the rights of the Purdue business. Will you tell me exactly what happened?" "I don't know," said the uncle. "I really don't know if I ought. But I think I will. Not just now, though. I'll tell you what, if it's fine tomorrow, we'll take a walk in the morning, and tonight I'll think over the whole affair and get it straight in my mind. I have often felt somebody besides me ought to know about it, and all his people are out of the way now." The next day was fine, and the two men walked out to a hill at no great distance, which was known as Windmill Hill. The mill that had topped it was gone, but a bit of the brick foundation remained, and afforded a seat from which a good stretch of pleasant, wild country could be seen. Here, then, Mr. A and Mr. B sat down on the short, dry grass with their backs against the warm brick wall, and Mr. A produced a little bundle of folded paper and a pocket-book, which he held up before Mr. B as an indication that he was prepared not only to tell the story to which he stood pledged, but to back it with documentary evidence. "I brought you here," he said, "partly because you can see Purdue's place. There." He pointed with his stick to a wooden slope which might be 3 or 4 miles off. In the wood was a large clearing, and in the clearing stood a mansion of yellow stone with a portico, upon which, as it chanced, the sun was shining very brilliantly, so that the house stood out brightly against the background of dark trees. "Where shall I begin?" said Mr. A. "Why," said Mr. B, "I'll tell you exactly how little I know, and then you can judge. You and Purdue, you remember, were senior to me at school and at Cambridge. He went down after his 3 years. You stayed up for part of a 4th, and then I began to see more of you. Before that, I was more with people in my own year, and beyond a fair number of meetings with Purdue at breakfast and lunch and so on, I never saw much of him, not nearly as much as I should have liked, in fact. Then I remember you going to stay with him, there, I suppose," pointing with his stick, "in the Easter vac, and, well, that was the last of it." "Just so," said Mr. A. "I didn't come up again, and you and I practically didn't meet till a year or 2 back, did we? Though you were a better correspondent than any of my other Cambridge friends. Very well, then. There it is. I was never inclined to write the story down in a letter, and the long and the short of it is that you've never heard of it. But you do know what sort of man Purdue was, and how fond I was of him. When I stayed with him over there, the place was his only home, and yet it wasn't his. He was an orphan and practically adopted by his uncle and aunt, who were quite old, childless people. There had been another uncle who'd married a village woman and had 1 daughter. The couple were very odd, squalid creatures and died off, I think, from drink, but the daughter survived and went on living in a cottage in the next parish. She wasn't left destitute by any means in the way of money, but she lived all by herself, and I think always with a sense of injury upon her that she wasn't noticed by the county families and such. The remaining uncle and aunt had been kind enough to her, and at one time used to invite her over to their place, but she had a very difficult temper and was always on the lookout for slights and injuries, and at last they gave up the effort to be cordial and saw no more of her. It wasn't to be expected after that they would pass on the property to her. It was entirely at their disposition to do what they liked with it, and no more they did. When they died it went to Purdue. About a year before his own death, that was. So there he was, settled, you would say, into a happy life. He'd been brought up in the country and knew all the neighbourhood, places and people very well, and was interested in farming and forestry and prepared to make himself useful. The visit I paid him that Christmas was particularly delightful. He was on such excellent terms with everybody in the village. Master Henry to all of them, and just as well liked by the neighbours in the larger houses. I think the only fly in the ointment was that woman, Caroline Purdue. She had taken to attending our parish church, and we used to find her in our pew every Sunday morning. She didn't say much to Henry, but all the service time she sat and looked at him through her veil. A short, stout, red-faced woman she was, with black hair and snappy black eyes. She used to wait in the churchyard till we'd gone out, and then set off on her 3-mile walk home. She gave me the creeps. I couldn't say why. I suppose there was a flavour of concentrated hostility about her. Henry was anxious of something of the same kind. His lawyer told me, after his death, that he tried through them to get her to accept a handsome addition to her income, and the gift of a suitable house wherever she liked in some other part of the country. They said she was as impracticable a woman as they'd ever come across. She just sat and smiled broadly at them, and said she was quite comfortable where she was, and didn't want to move out of reach of her cousin Henry. But wouldn't it be more lively and amusing for you to be in some place where there'd be more to be seen? Theatres, that sort of thing. Oh, no. She had plenty of things to occupy herself with, and, again, she didn't want to move out of reach of her cousin Henry. But your cousin Henry, you know, he's likely to be a busy man, travelling about a good deal, and occupied with his men friends. It isn't probable that he'll be able to see much of you. Oh, she was quite content to take her chance of that. They would often be meeting when he was riding about, and no doubt there'd be times when he was alone at the court, and she could look in on him. Ah, well, that's just the point. Are you sure that Mr. Purdew will welcome that? Yes, to be sure, why not? Well, we have reason to think that he doesn't wish it. Oh, indeed. And pray, had he commissioned these gentlemen to tell his own cousin that he'd cast her off? A nice thing for a relative to hear, that her own flesh and blood preferred not to have anything to do with her? What had she done, she should like to know, to be treated in that way? There was more to the same effect, and the storm rose quickly, culminating in a short burst of tears and a rapid stumping out of the room. The gentlemen who'd been conducting the interview were left looking at each other and feeling they had not done much to advance their client's wishes. But at least Miss Purdew left off with her attendance at our church, and we gathered did not favour any other place of worship in its stead. She was not more popular with the rest of the community than with Henry. How is the rest of this to be told? I have here some papers which bear on it, but they are fragmentary, of course. When Henry Purdew was alone in that big house, he did what at other times was rather foreign to his habits, confided his feelings to paper. Here are some entries. Letter from C.P., Caroline Purdew, of course. Infernal woman. May she come and see me and talk over this painful matter? No, she mayn't. This was dated January, 18 blank. Another entry from the same month reads, Lunch with Ferrars, Henry's lawyer, was disturbed by the arrival of C.P., who presented herself at the front door and was with difficulty persuaded to leave. Cannot think how she got past the gate. She is known to everyone on the estate. February the 20th, 18 blank. Another letter from C.P. Burnt it without opening. There are more entries like these, said Mr. A. I shan't read them all. Miss Purdew seems to have been an unusually persistent person. Rebuffs only made her the more determined. When her attempts to gain access to Henry failed, she clearly decided to try another tack. He drew out another paper. Look here, March the 3rd, 18 blank. Dixon came up from the gatehouse at lunchtime with a brace of pheasants, saying that Miss Purdew had sent them. Wretched creature. Of course, it was too late to send them back, and I was hard put to know what to do with them. I had no intention of eating them myself. In the end, I told him to throw them out. That was shortly before the end of term. Henry had written to me, asking me to go to him for the Easter vac. I had thought of visiting some of my own people, but Henry's invitation was urgent. He said he had some matter over which he particularly wished to ask my advice. There was an anxious, insistent tone to his letter, which was quite unlike Henry. Of course I said I would go. When I got there, I found Henry rather thinner than when I'd last seen him, but very much the same Henry as ever, except that he seemed a little irritable. There was an incident on the day I arrived. I couldn't make much of it at the time. We went into the drawing-room for tea, and there was a large vase on one of the tables, full of those white flowers. What do they call them? Easter lilies. Henry seemed struck by them and asked the girl who was setting out the tea things where they'd come from. She was sure she couldn't say. She thought someone had delivered them. There was no note. Henry seemed unaccountably annoyed by this reply. He paced twice up and down the room with a thunderous face, and then he seized the lilies out of the vase and strode over to the window, where he hurled the lot out into the shrubbery. The girl was open-mouthed, and I uttered a word or two of remonstrance, which Henry did not appear to hear. He said something under his breath, something like, "She shan't," and then he flung himself down into a chair and put a hand to his brow. "I suppose you think I've taken leave of my senses," he said, when the girl had left the room. He gave a short laugh. "The truth is, I'm not too sure that I haven't. It's that woman, the one who styles herself my cousin. Well," he added with sudden energy, "Cousin Henry is not at home to visitors. Not now, not ever. She can send what she likes." I ventured to ask, whether the lilies had come from Miss Purdew. "Of course they did," said Henry impatiently, "but she needn't think she can frighten me like that." The offending flowers had certainly had a somewhat funereal appearance, but it was hard to see how they could be perceived as a form of intimidation. I tried to hint as much, but Henry was unusually touchy and inclined to snap at me. "The lilies were not the first present which Miss Purdew had sent to the court," he said. "She was always sending things. At first he thought she was trying to ingratiate herself, but now she was becoming a nuisance, and he wouldn't have it." There was a fretful tone in his voice which was quite new to me. Henry had always been a level-headed sort of person, not the type to allow himself to be upset by such a thing. I remembered the letter he'd sent me, and wondered whether the matter of Miss Purdew was the thing about which he'd wish to consult me. When I asked him directly about it, he was at first very reluctant to get to the point. But eventually he told me a very curious story. It seems that Miss Purdew had indeed been sending things to the court, all sorts of items, with the compliments of his cousin. Once it was a brace of pheasants, another time a bottle of some evil-looking beverage, which Henry had immediately thrown out. After a while the accompanying messages had stopped, but items had continued to arrive, which Henry assumed had originated with Miss Purdew. He felt convinced, he said, that she'd given up trying to make friends with him, and that now she had quite another motive. He thought she was trying to introduce something into the house. "I know how ridiculous that sounds," he said, "but I can't shake the idea. Why, just yesterday there was a ragged little girl came to the back door and offered the cook a bunch of herbs, but she wouldn't take anything for them. I should like to have such hawkers coming to me," I said, trying to lift the mood, but Henry didn't smile. "No, you wouldn't," he said. He gave a long sigh. "That's not the end of it. A couple of weeks ago the rector, Dr. Bertram, you remember him, was invited to dine with me. Well, at the last minute he sent to say that he would be unavoidably delayed. When he did eventually arrive, he was obviously upset. We sat down to dinner, and he hummed and hawed for a while before he came to the point. He said that someone had been in the churchyard and had disturbed one of the graves. Dug about in it, he said. The soil was all heaped up as though the grave had just been freshly turned. He couldn't say whether anything had been damaged or removed. He hardly dared to disturb it any further. He'd simply told old Bowes, the sexton, to make it neat again. Dr. Bertram's embarrassment was so obvious that even before he told me, I had guessed whose grave it was which had been desecrated. It was that of my uncle, Purdew. Shocked as I was, my mind sprang immediately to Caroline Purdew. Henry paused. "Surely you don't suggest that your cousin had anything to do with it?" I said. "I do," he said. "My uncle hadn't an enemy in the world. Besides, I was not the only one who jumped to that conclusion. She is not well liked in the village, you know. Dr. Bertram told me that old Bowes had said it must be her. Always hanging about, he said, though she never attended the services any more like a Christian person. Dr. Bertram had been unable to stop him blabbering about it, and eventually someone had gone to Miss Purdew's cottage, but found it all shut up. It looked as though she'd gone away, he said. In the absence of any definite proof, it hardly seemed right to summon the constable, so Dr. Bertram and I determined to ride out there ourselves the next morning and speak to Miss Purdew. At any rate, it seemed she'd got her wish at last, for she could expect a visit from her cousin Henry, though I doubted she'd like what her affectionate cousin had to say. When we got there, however, we found that the cottage was indeed shut up, and it looked as though it had been so for some time. We asked about, and nobody had seen her in recent days, but none of her neighbours could say where she'd gone to. She kept herself to herself, they said. At any rate, you're well rid of her, I said. That's just it. I don't think I am rid of her, said Henry. I can't shake the feeling she's trying to get at me somehow. The things she keeps sending. The things, I interrupted, which may or may not be from her. Your cousin may well be established at Bournemouth, in which case the next gift you can expect will be some horrid souvenir. Henry didn't laugh. If she succeeds, he said, what then? Then nothing, I retorted robustly. Put it out of your mind. I'm not sure that Henry did succeed in putting the matter out of his mind, but at any rate he'd composed himself, and the rest of the day passed off without incident. It must have been about a week later that I noticed a change in Henry's manner, a gradual dropping off in spirits. He seemed unaccountably nervous, and his tendency to irritability erupted several times into actual anger over some trivial thing, a dish which was not to his taste, an unmarked parcel which turned out to be nothing more alarming than a couple of old books sent over on approval. On one occasion he worked himself up into a rage over, of all things, the kitchen cat, which he said should be drowned if it didn't keep the rats down. The housekeeper ventured to say that, begging Mr. Purdew's pardon, so far as she knew there were no rats in the court. "Of course there are," retorted Henry. "I hear them in the passage at nights, pattering up and down." In Henry's overwrought state of mind there seemed a definite risk that he might really try to drown the wretched cat himself. I interposed with a suggestion that he have the gamekeeper's terrier brought into the house to look for the offending vermin. As soon as we were alone, I spoke to him quite plainly and asked him what was troubling him. He seemed positively relieved to be asked. He wouldn't have told anyone else, he said, not even Dr. Bertram. They would think he was mad. He said he had a peculiar feeling all the time of being watched. He thought it had started about a week before, though he couldn't say why. Nothing in particular had occurred at that time. "No, not watched," he said, "stalked. I feel somehow that I'm never quite alone. It's worse at night, you know. The passage is so damnably dark. I feel as though I were playing that abominable game that children play. Yes, that's it, bear. At the turn of the staircase, I always have a very distinct feeling that something is waiting in the darkness at the top, waiting to spring upon me." He gave a sigh which was terrible to hear. Of course I did my best to talk him out of what seemed a morbidly imaginative state of mind. "A good night's sleep will cure you of fancies of that sort," I told him roundly. Henry gave a bitter laugh. "A good night's sleep? Yes, if I could only stop myself from dreaming." I thought little of this at the time, but a couple of evenings later, when we were in the library together, digesting a rather indifferent dinner with the assistance of some very good cigars, Henry brought up the subject again. I'd noticed that as the hour grew later, Henry had become restless. He glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece every few minutes, and lingered interminably over his brandy. Clearly something was on his mind, and eventually he resolved to speak. He introduced the subject in a roundabout way by asking me whether I had read Macrobius's Commentarii in Somnium Scipionis, and what I thought of it. As you know, that was not really my field, but as it happens, I had read parts of it. I said I supposed it was interesting, in its way. "Interesting?" said Henry, looking at me somewhat sharply. "Yes, certainly it is interesting, but you don't think there's anything in it?" "Certainly there is something in it," I said. "Doesn't he say that most dreams are caused by overindulging in food and drink?" "Some dreams," Henry corrected me, rather irritably. "Others, he says, are oracular or actually prophetic." "And some are simply nightmares," I pointed out. "Yes," said Henry eagerly, "but how to tell which is which, that is the question." He shook his head. I had nothing to say to this. It was clearly not the moment to tell Henry that I thought the idea of prophetic dreams preposterous. So I smoked for a while in silence and waited for him to go on, which he eventually did. It will not come as a surprise to you that Henry himself was suffering from unpleasant dreams, or rather, I should say, from one dream, which recurred with painful regularity. Henry said that in the dream he always found himself outside the closed door of his own bedroom, but that either he found himself in the person of someone else, or he was somehow outside his own body, for he had always had the conviction that he, Henry, was asleep in bed on the other side of the door. The passage was very dark, so that one could hardly have made out anyone who came down it. But all the same, Henry said, he thought he could perceive movement at the other end of it. He did not think it was a person, quite, although it was about the size of one. It was too dreadfully thin, and from the way it moved he surmised there was something odd about its limbs. Either there were too many joints, or some of them bent the wrong way. He couldn't really say. It seemed to come on with a lurching, scuttling gait like a gigantic spider, with the ends of the limbs scrabbling energetically at the walls. Henry said that the sight of this creature was nearly enough to send him out of his wits, and yet it never attempted any sort of attack upon him, Somehow he knew that its intentions were focused upon the person lying in the bed, behind the closed door. He would always wake up before the thing reached the door, or else the dream would pass away into some other nonsensical scene. The whole dream was disgusting enough, Henry said, but the worst of it was the thing he saw was hungry. When he finished speaking, he looked at me expectantly, and I was forced to say something or other about dreams going by contraries, which sounded lame enough. No, he said. It's not to be explained away as easily as that. I'm convinced there is malice in it. But how, he went on, more to himself than to me, how she got it in, I cannot think. She, I took to be his troublesome cousin, Caroline Purdew. There was no possible reply to this. I couldn't conceive that his cousin was responsible for the dreams, except inasmuch as the thought of her weighed upon Henry's mind. Soon after that we parted for the night. About an hour and a half later, I was torn abruptly from a deep sleep by the sound of a door slamming close by. The next second there came a scream. I can't begin to describe it to you. It sounded as though someone were undergoing the most hideous tortures, a mixture of mortal pain and terrible fear. For several seconds I lay paralyzed in the bed, too stricken with horror to move. Then as the scream died away, I pulled myself together and leapt up. I snatched up a heavy candlestick to use as a weapon, if need be, and ran out into the passage. A moment later I felt myself thrust aside as easily as if I'd been a child by someone who moved with the rough energy of a beast. Staggering back against the panelling, I saw a shaft of moonlight coming through the narrow window fall onto the head and the shoulders. I could not help uttering a cry of disgust. The next instant the figure had been swallowed again by the dark. Stumbling towards Henry's door, I saw his housekeeper at the top of the stairs. She'd thrown a shawl around her shoulders and carried a lamp, which threw a yellowish light onto features rendered almost stupid by terror. "Here, give me that lamp," I snapped at her. "Henry," I called in a louder tone. There was no reply, although his door stood half open. I suppose I knew what I should find before I entered the room. I don't know what Henry had been doing when the thing found him. A number of books were strewn around the floor amid the smashed remains of a lamp. It was a miracle the place hadn't been set alight. Henry himself, what remained of him, was on the bed, the sheets of which were pulled and dragged about as though a desperate struggle had taken place. The bed curtains on the side of it had been half ripped down. I took one look at that brown and shrunken face, and turned aside with a stifled oath. The housekeeper had no such restraint. "Master's been turned into a monkey," she screamed, and instantly went into hysterics. By this time Henry's man had arrived, and between us we got her and the other servants out of the room and closed the door. There was nothing we could do for Henry, of course. You will ask me what it was that pushed past me in the passage. I can only tell you this. Henry said the thing which frightened him so much in his dreams was thin, but this was fat. The head, I only saw it from the back, not the face, for which I am profoundly grateful, and the shoulders were bare, and so swollen that the flesh had a greasy shine to it. So grotesquely bloated was it, that no neck was discernible, only a deep crease between head and trunk. Henry had said he thought the thing was hungry. Now it was no longer hungry. It was full. Of course there was an inquiry. I contributed what I could. Henry's falling out, if you can call it that, with Caroline Purdew was well known locally, but the woman herself could not be traced, nor was she to be found at any time afterwards. I confirmed that Henry had anticipated some nuisance from his easily offended cousin, but that I had not recognized Henry's assailant. I couldn't give a full description, of course. I said I thought the person was corpulent. The day after Henry's death, I went to Henry's room again to perform what last little service I could for my poor friend, by picking up and ordering the books which had been strewn about the floor. I found the housekeeper in the room. I think she'd come to put down the blinds. As I entered, I heard her make a little exclamation. "Begging your pardon, Mr. A," she said, "I really can't think what this is doing here." She indicated an inoffensive-looking plant in a rather ornate pot. It might have been an Oriental ginger jar. It rather had that look. It was sitting on the window ledge, mostly hidden by the curtain. Not a very pretty thing, I agreed. It's basil, sir, she said, in an indignant tone. I suppose the events of the previous night had told on her nerves, because she was not content until she'd summoned several of the housemaids and asked them who had put a pot of basil in the master's bedroom, as she certainly had not placed it there. Eventually it was established that the newest girl had put it there a day or two before, thinking it was some sort of houseplant. The housekeeper rolled her eyes significantly at this evidence of ignorance. Where had she got it from? She insisted upon knowing. After some hesitation, the girl explained that someone had brought the plant to the back door. No, she couldn't say who, not even if it had been a man or a woman. She didn't think much of it at the time. It seemed she'd only been employed at the house for a few days, and was not aware of Henry's instructions regarding the acceptance of unexpected deliveries. She'd thought the pot pretty, and had taken the liberty of setting it there in the window. She hadn't thought that she was doing anything wrong. It was apparent that the girl was close to tears. The housekeeper relented. "Well, well," she said, "can't bother the master now, but you can take it down to the kitchen. Look lively now." The girl made to pick up the pot, but whether she was clumsy or simply nervous, it slipped out of her hands and smashed to pieces on the floor. I hardly took in the housekeeper's fresh cries of vexation. Something lay there among the shards of broken pottery and clumps of earth, something I did not like to touch with my bare hands. In the end I got out my handkerchief and picked it up using that. It was a little bundle of bones and what looked like twigs tied together with a ragged and discoloured piece of ribbon. The twigs were much scratched about, as though someone had tried to carve a pattern into them, but it was inexpertly done. I could make no sense of it. Later that day I rode over to Dr. Bertram's and showed him the little bundle. He looked at them for a long time, and then he looked at me. "We had better tell the servants they were animal bones," he said, "and I shall ask Bose. No, bother the man, he won't be able to keep his mouth shut. I shall deal with it myself. Well, well. This is a very bad business. Poor Perdue." Poor Henry indeed. After I left the court I suffered a nervous reaction to what had occurred. I never went back up to Cambridge. A change of scene recommended itself, and I went abroad, pleading my health. I recovered my spirits, of course, though it was a long time before I felt quite comfortable in a strange house after dark, especially if there was no gaslight. "Still," said Mr. A, sliding the folded papers back into his pocket, "I can't forget that scream, you know, Henry's scream. However long I live, I don't suppose I shall ever enjoy hearing anyone play that infernal game any more. The game of bear." Self-Catering by Helen Grant. Of course it's no use Watson complaining. It was all his fault in the first place. He was the one who told me I needed a holiday. I can remember it quite clearly. It was a grey, wet Friday afternoon in March, and I was sitting in that cubby-hole of an office of mine, going through a stack of invoices and sipping Margot's foul instant coffee out of a mug with a chip in it. Watson gave one of those irritatingly jaunty little double knocks on the door, and came waltzing in, without waiting for me to reply. As usual, he was dressed a bit too flashily for Lord and Son. He wore a double-breasted suit with a red silk handkerchief sticking out of the front pocket, and he had that jovial, self-satisfied look on his well-fed face. "What are you up to then, Larkin?" he said, without any introduction, and then he followed it up, as I knew he would, with that infuriating quip. "Still larking around, eh? Get it, eh? Larking around? Get it, eh? Eh? Eh?" I did my best to ignore him, but it didn't work. It never did. Watson had the hide of a rhinoceros. He came and perched on the corner of my desk and made a show of craning over to see what top-secret thing I was working on. When I didn't respond, he played his trump card. He said, "You're looking a bit peaky, Larkin. You want to watch it, old son, or one day you'll turn your toes up at that desk of yours. You should get out more." Well, he'd got me on my weak spot there. In those days, I used to suffer a lot with my asthma, and immediately I started wondering if I'd been overdoing it. Was I really looking that bad? Watson saw my expression and pressed home his advantage. "You should take a holiday," he said impressively, flourishing a plump finger with an enormous signet ring at me. "You don't need to tell me that," I said stiffly, and then I followed it up, I don't know why, with, "I'm going to book one this weekend, as a matter of fact." Watson laughed that infuriating laugh of his. "That's so," he said. "I'll have to come round on Monday then, and you can tell me all about it." "I doubt you'd be interested," I replied as coldly as I could. "Our tastes are not the same." "Ho, ho," he laughed in that revoltingly hearty way. "Well, I'll see you on Monday then." He got off my desk with all the elegance of a water buffalo. "Keep larking around," was his parting shot, before he took himself and his red silk handkerchief off somewhere else. The trouble with people like Watson is that they do that. They force you into a corner. They goad you until you make some silly remark. Then you've committed yourself, and you can't go back on it without making yourself look stupid. Of course, I hadn't thought of taking a holiday before then, but now I had to book one before Monday. And then I couldn't help worrying a bit about what Watson had said. Did I really look peaky? Perhaps I did need a holiday. At any rate, the next morning saw me up bright and early, walking down the high street looking for a travel agent. I'd never particularly looked for one before. I don't usually go on an organised holiday. I just spend a couple of weeks with my sister in Bournemouth. So this was a bit of a voyage of discovery, as you might say. The first one I went into was no good at all. It was one of those chains, and it was all Ibiza this and Tenerife that, not at all suitable for a person of mature years and sober habits. I asked the girl on the desk if they did Swan Hellenic, and she stopped chewing her gum just long enough to say, "Where's that then?" After that I found myself out in the street again with no further ideas. I wandered about a bit, but didn't see anywhere else I could try, and frankly, I was starting to worry about what Watson had said again. Perhaps all this walking around was stressing my body too. I decided that the best course of action would be to find a cafe and have a cup of tea and a bun whilst I plotted my next move. And that was how I found the place. I passed a side street with a little sign at the end of it reading Jane's Coffee Shop. I went down the street, but I never got as far as Jane's because the first thing I came to was a travel agent. I could see at once that this was a whole different kettle of fish from the last place. For starters, it didn't have that nasty, flashy look the other agents had. There were no fluorescent yellow posters with special offer plastered all over them in the window. It looked neat and quiet and, well, staid. It looked like the place for gentlemen travellers, not teenage tourists. And secondly, the name painted over the quaint wooden door was a genuinely exotic one. Cornelius von Teufel, travel specialist, it read. You couldn't get more foreign than that. He was sure to be an expert on all things continental. I pushed open the wooden door and went inside. The door opening struck a little bell which jangled as I went into the shop. It was a nice old-fashioned touch, I thought. Almost as soon as the bell rang, a man wafted out from the back of the shop somewhere. His tread was so noiseless he might have been on casters. He was about 60, I should say, and dressed in an immaculate dark grey suit with a white shirt and a very sober dark tie. The only adornment was a little gold tie-pin with some sort of funny little symbol on it. It created a very refined effect, as did his neat little beard trimmed to a point. His hair was receding, revealing a high-domed forehead, but he had resisted the temptation to comb it over the bald patch. His eyes twinkled behind little steel-rimmed glasses. "Cornelius von Teufel," he said in a soft and very slightly accented voice. He held out a perfectly manicured hand. "How may I help you?" "Edward Larkin, pleased to meet you," I said, shaking his hand. "I'd like to book a holiday." He made me a little bow. Really, his manners were perfectly gentlemanly, and I congratulated myself on finding the shop. It was a cut above the other place, that was for certain. "You are, of course, aware that we specialize?" von Teufel enquired. "Well," I replied as grandly as I could, "I am looking for something, shall we say, exclusive." Then I added, "What sort of thing do you specialize in?" "Spiritual journeys," he announced. His eyes sparkled behind the little glasses, and for a moment he became much more animated, carried away, no doubt, by enthusiasm for the job. "Spiritual journeys?" I repeated, a bit doubtfully. I had visions of a week in a monastic retreat or a course on art history, neither of which appealed. If I wanted boredom, I could get it at any day of the week at Lauder's. Yes, he said, positively gushing with enthusiasm. For the truly sensitive, the truly open-minded individual, we offer a range of unique supernatural experiences. Supernatural? I gaped at him for a moment before I remembered to shut my mouth. Oh yes, he went on, for those who have ever wondered whether there is really anything out there, whether life continues after we have shuffled off this mortal coil, or for those who simply wish to experience the ultimate frisson that only comes from a close encounter with the world beyond, Von Teufel travel offers a unique opportunity to find out. And he went on a bit more like that while I digested what he just said. Of course, it had to be a gimmick, though it was a new one, I'd give him that. Furthermore, he'd got himself a good audience this time. Not a lot of people know this, not even my sister, bless her. But I'm quite an avid reader of what they call genre fiction in my spare time. Call it my private vice, if you like. Where other fellows like to peruse the sports pages of the Telegraph, or even read rags like Playboy, like Watson, for example, I shouldn't wonder, well, I like to curl up with a good horror novel. It takes me out of myself, as they say. So one way and another I quite enjoyed Cornelius von Teufel's little performance, and of course I decided to enter into the spirit of it. Well, let me see what you can offer, I said gamely. Ah, a true connoisseur, he beamed. Step this way, if you would, please. We went towards the back of the shop, where there was a little area that looked more like a gentleman's club than anything, all green leather chairs, sporting prints on the walls, and an expensive-looking Persian rug. I sat in one of the chairs, and he fussed around gathering papers together. Eventually he sat in a chair opposite me and perused the uppermost sheet over the top of his spectacles. Many of our clients enjoy the more traditional trips, he began. I can offer you the Bram Stoker Special, which comprises a 5-day tour of Transylvania, including Castle Dracula, and ends up with a visit to the Lair of the White Worm, very popular, especially with vermologists. I shuddered. Not really my cup of tea. Alternatively, he went on, undaunted, we can offer music lovers the chance to experience the beautiful city of Paris with the Gaston Leroux Phantom Deluxe. Music lovers, I repeated, visions of the Moulin Rouge rising enticingly before my eyes. Opera, of course, he remarked in his quiet voice. Opera. Fat women with hordes of chins screeching away in Viking helmets? Hastily I held up my hand. No, thank you. Not, I continued, seeing one of those neat eyebrows rising slightly, that I have anything against culture. Then perhaps you would enjoy our Haywain trip, suggested Von Teufel, an opportunity to literally step into the mind of the artist. Haywain, I said, isn't that by Constable, on with the horses and the river? Pardon me for saying so, but I don't see anything particularly supernatural about that. Ah, yes, a number of people have made that assumption, he said. The name actually refers to the Haywain by Hieronymus Bosch. He fell silent for a moment, reflecting. I rather think we must change the name of that particular trip. There have been complaints. I recall one elderly gentleman explicitly objected to the impaling. Some people have, I fear, very little appreciation for medieval symbolism. Look here, I said. I'm sure impaling and gigantic worms are all very well in their place, but I'm really looking for something a bit more subtle. This is supposed to be a holiday, after all. Don't you have anything with just a suggestion of nastiness rather than going the whole hog? To give him his due, Von Teufel took this on the chin. Absolutely, he said very smoothly, without any sign of offence. For those who prefer a more understated apparition, I would thoroughly recommend the M.R. James Memorial Trip to Burnstow. This sounded a lot more interesting. I sat forward. What does that involve? I asked, hopefully. First-class travel to and from Burnstow, a tour of the beach and a visit to the Green Dragon, he informed me. Well, that sounds excellent, I said, starting to feel quite enthusiastic. Then a thought struck me. Hang on, I don't remember any Green Dragon, I said. Wasn't it the Globe Inn in the story? He had the grace to look a little ashamed. Indeed it was, Mr. Larkin, you are quite right. So what's the Green Dragon, then? It's a top-quality laundrette, he admitted. There is a good deal of crumpled linen, he added. It's not really the same, though, is it? I remarked. Why can't I visit the Globe instead? Alas, not possible, he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of regret. It burnt to the ground some years ago. A fire in the linen cupboard, I believe. Some guests were charged, but I don't believe it came to anything. I sighed. I'm very sorry, but none of these really appeals. Is there nothing else you can offer me? Well, he replied slowly, as though debating whether to commit himself. For particular, very valued customers, we do offer a self-catering option. Self-catering? I said. You mean I would stay in a haunted house? Can you absolutely guarantee it would be haunted? Oh, yes, he said with enthusiasm. He looked straight at me, and I saw his eyes twinkling behind his steel-rimmed glasses. It would be 100% guaranteed to be haunted. Wonderful, I said. Can you show me some properties? Of course. He arose and fetched a thick file, which he spread on an occasional table before me. We have a range of properties, including period houses, several castles, an old mill, and a lighthouse. I leaned over and peered at the pictures. What about this? I asked. Borley Rectory. I've heard of that one. Alas, fully booked for the foreseeable future, said von Teufel. But if you would prefer an ecclesiastical environment, we have a very nice vicarage in Hampshire. Well, let's take a look, I said, thinking that it would be very convenient if I wanted to run down and see my sister for the day. I perused the photograph. It was a very attractive property, Queen Anne, I think they called it, with red bricks and white windows. I see it has 4 bedrooms, I commented, running my eye down the information printed underneath the photo. Yes, indeed, said von Teufel quietly. He looked at me meditatively. For you, Mr. Larkin, I think I would suggest the blue bedroom. I won't bore you with a discussion about possible dates and all the rest of it. Eventually I got out my little-used credit card and paid a sizable deposit to Von Teufel Travel, then signed a contract. Of course, you will say I should have read the small print, but Von Teufel seemed such a gentleman I felt it would be pointedly impolite to give him the 3rd degree about the details. The only thing I did think was a bit funny at the time was that the contract was all written in red ink, but I thought perhaps that was something to do with travel regulations. Anyway, I signed with a flourish, and was just straightening up when von Teufel came up close to me with something glittering in his hand. I took it for a silver fountain pen, thinking he was going to add his own name to the contract or something. You will think me dreadfully naive, but I didn't even smell a rat when he asked me to stand up a little straighter. Obligingly I did so, and with one wonderfully swift movement he flourished the glittering object aloft, and then plunged it into my chest. You know, they say it is remarkably difficult to stab someone in the heart, regardless of what might occur in popular fiction. The organ is well protected in its cage of ribs, and genuine stabs to the heart are usually the result of luck, rather than judgment. All I can say on this point is that Cornelius von Teufel was either very lucky or extremely skilful in his aim. The side of the blade scraped a little against one rib, I'll grant you that, but otherwise his aim was true, and the knife slid into my heart and punctured it like a balloon. It's a very curious experience, I can tell you, to feel one's heart skewered, like a piece of barbecued meat. Instantly I felt the front of my shirt grow hot and wet, but after that I felt very little, for the room was growing dim and faint around me. I could feel my heart making one last sad attempt to beat, and the blood came pumping out over my hands and pattered down onto my shoes. I tottered on my feet, and Cornelius von Teufel laid a steadying hand on my shoulder. At last I drifted away into blackness. I heard his soft voice say, "Bon voyage." That puzzled me a bit. I could have sworn he was German. So here I am, in the Blue Room, on what you might call an extended holiday. At any rate, I've plenty of spare time, and my asthma no longer bothers me. No lungs, you see. The vicarage isn't inhabited by the living just at present, but I'm not lonely. I have company. One of the things that you may not know, if you've not yet crossed the Great Divide, is that the recently deceased do have a certain amount of influence, especially those who've died a violent death. It's comparatively short-lived, which is why so many apparitions have to vent their wrath through groaning and clanking and other ineffectual activities. But for a short time the influence is relatively powerful. In death I like to think I demonstrated a little more drive than I ever did in life, working at Lauder's. What I did was this. I encouraged Watson to take a holiday too. I think he should be grateful, really. Actual death couldn't possibly be any worse than working at Lauder's for another 30 years, but all the same he never stops complaining. The trouble with Watson is that he's terribly vain, and there's no doubt his looks have changed a little, and not for the better. Cornelius von Teufel stabbed him twice, you see, through the eyes, and it's hard to look debonair if your eyes look like two overcooked tomatoes that someone has punctured with a kebab skewer. Still, he's stuck with them now, and as I said at the beginning, he's only himself to blame. Gold by Helen Grant. Gold, that's what's in it for me. The speaker himself had a gilded appearance. Fair hair bleached almost white by the sun, tanned skin with a faint metallic sheen of perspiration. His green eyes were flecked with motes of gold, giving them an opalescent appearance, at once beautiful and cold. Decker knew him as Mertens, but that was probably not his original name. It was hot inside the cafe, and hotter still outside. Within there were flies, attracted by the smell of food. Several of them were exploring the sticky residue of sugar in the glass teacups. Outside there was dust and the stabbing brightness of the midday sun. "If there's gold, why would you share it with me?" asked Decker bluntly. Mertens raised a hand in a pantomime of helplessness. "You know I can't sell anything on, not after what happened last time. That sanctimonious little prick of a curator has seen to that." "You can't blame him," said Decker mildly. "It's not a matter of blame. It's fact. He's ruined a business it took me decades to build." "An illegal business?" Mertens gave a contemptuous snort. "Don't be so holier-than-thou. I can go elsewhere, you know." He picked up the packet of cigarettes lying next to his cup, as though he meant to leave. "All right," said Decker hastily. "I was just making conversation. Tell me about it. This place. Where is it?" Mertens looked at him for a few moments, letting silence stretch out between them. His reticence was intended to say, "I don't need you. I'm having to consider whether to trust you at all." Decker knew this perfectly well, and he simply waited. "I don't need to tell you," said Mertens eventually. He leaned towards Decker, elbow on the stained tabletop, the cigarette pack still clasped in his fingers. His other hand, the right one, remained jammed in his pocket, Decker noticed. "I'll take you there. You couldn't find it on your own anyway, even if I did tell you." Decker doubted that. He'd spent at least as long in this part of the world as Mertens had. He thought the man didn't want to tell him in case Decker decided to do some investigating of his own and cut Mertens out of it. Now it was his turn to be silenced, as he thought about this, and about the hand he couldn't see thrust deep into the man's pocket. What did he have in there? A knife? A small pistol? "Why would he threaten me, though?" he said to himself. "He needs me to sell whatever he's found. If something happens to me now, that's not going to happen." "When do you want to go?" he said at last, and he saw Mertens relax, almost imperceptibly. "I've got a vehicle outside," said Mertens, nodding towards the doorway. "Now? Why not now? You're not doing anything else, are you?" That was certainly true. There was nothing Decker couldn't put off for a day or even a week. There were no colleagues looking impatiently at their watches, waiting for his return. There wasn't anyone in the slovenly digs he called home. He got to his feet and followed Mertens outside, leaving a little heap of grubby banknotes to cover the tea. The vehicle proved to be a battered jeep parked in the shade of a compound wall, its driver dozing behind the wheel. Decker should not have been surprised to see the man. Most foreigners employed a local driver rather than negotiate the chaotic roads themselves, but he was still aware that he was now outnumbered. He swallowed his unease, reminding himself that Mertens needed him. There was no need to suspect any threat to himself. Mertens got in beside the driver. Decker climbed into the back. The engine roared into life, drowning out whatever Mertens said to the driver, but after they'd pulled away, Mertens turned round and shouted, "He doesn't speak English. You can say what you like." Decker nodded. He didn't believe Mertens. Since he'd arrived in the country, he hardly ever met anyone who didn't speak at least some English. Speaking to the driver would have been pointless, though, since it was nearly impossible to converse over the rumble of the engine and the air rushing past them as they accelerated. They drove out of the city, heading into the sun. Shops and cafes gave way to suburbs and then to arid open land with a sprinkling of desiccated shrubs. The road was almost the same colour as the sandy earth, and the air was unpleasantly gritty. The jeeps passing threw up a great plume of dust. Twice they passed through villages where the plainly constructed houses were also the colour of the earth. Men sitting outside tiny cafes watched incuriously as they passed. Once a group of little boys tried to run after the jeep, laughing and shouting. After the second village there was a long period of time in which Decker saw no habitations at all. Mertens turned again in his seat and handed over a plastic bottle of the local mineral water. The water was tepid, but Decker drank it gratefully. The sun was halfway down the sky when they came to a broad chasm with a river flowing along the bed of it. The jeep stopped a few meters from the edge. Mertens got out and Decker followed. The driver remained inside. As Decker was climbing out, he saw a movement out of the corner of his eye and glanced back. There was a blue and white glass talisman hanging from the rear-view mirror, and the man had reached up to touch it. "Isn't he coming?" he asked Mertens, jerking his head in the direction of the jeep. "No," said Mertens. "He's from that last village. None of them will come here." "Why not?" said Decker. "No, let me guess. It's that time-honoured cliché, the cursed place where none of the locals will go?" Mertens grunted mirthlessly. "Think yourself lucky. If they did go there, the place would have been picked clean long ago." He led Decker towards a gap in the bank which gave onto a steep slope, leading right down to the water. Decker looked back at the jeep. The engine was no longer running. The windshield glass reflected the brilliant sunshine, so the driver was invisible. A moment later, they were making their way down the slope, and the jeep vanished from sight. It took some time to get down to the riverbed. The surface of the slope was loose and treacherous. Decker imagined himself slipping, going over, hearing the snap of an ankle breaking. He winced. When they got to the bottom, Mertens gestured upstream. "It's 10, maybe 15 minutes from here." In fact, it took 20. Decker wasn't as fit as Mertens, and he didn't know the ground. He put his foot into an unexpectedly damp hollow and felt viscous mud oozing into his leather shoe. After that, he looked at Mertens' firmly laced boots with envy. As they moved upriver, the bank developed a more pronounced overhang. Decker was perspiring heavily now, and strands of dark hair were sticking to his forehead. He looked up the bank and saw what seemed like pieces of masonry half buried in the sandy earth. If he had not been so hot and tired, he'd have stopped to take a closer look. As it was, Mertens was forging ahead, and he had to exert himself to keep up. "There," said Mertens at last, pointing. Protruding from the bank was a great chunk of stone. It was clearly not a natural rock formation. The smooth face and geometrically precise corners at the top proved that. At a little distance was another slab, seemingly damaged. A sliver of stone several meters long had sheared off it, leaving a rugged surface. Between the two was a dark opening, taller than it was wide. The rim of it was crumbling, but its shape was still suggestive of human design. The two men laboured their way up the slope. Halfway to the opening, Decker motioned for Mertens to stop for a moment. He was breathing hard, his mouth unexpectedly dry. When he caught his breath a little, he nodded at the gap. "It's man-made, all right, and it could be from the correct period. But it can't be Midas' tomb, you know that. They found that in 1957 in Gordian." "I didn't say it was Midas' tomb," said Mertens tersely. "I said it was associated with Midas." "There are inscriptions, then?" "No, I told you. There's gold." Decker stared at him. There are holes all over this story, he thought. No inscriptions? It could be anything. And if there were enough gold in there for people to start talking about Midas, it would have been plundered long ago, local superstition or not. Mertens stared back briefly, seeing skepticism on Decker's face. Then he began to ascend the slope again, floundering in the loose sand. When he fell to his knees, Decker thought he'd simply stumbled. But then Mertens was pawing at the sand with his hands, unearthing something. Something, Decker noticed, that gleamed in the sunlight. "Here," shouted Mertens over his shoulder, and Decker went up the slope to see what he'd uncovered. It was a hand. A golden hand. As Decker approached, the sunshine was briefly reflected from it, dazzlingly. Then his shadow fell across it, and he was able to see it more clearly. It was brilliantly realistic. He knelt to examine it, and saw how beautifully the anatomy of the hand was done. The taut rope of the palmaris longus, the cushion of the thenar eminence, the fingernails, the creases of the palm, the very walls of the fingertips were perfectly executed. And stunningly, it did genuinely appear to be fashioned of gold. It was bright and untarnished, suggesting purity, although perhaps the cleanness of the surface was the work of the shifting sands. A very high carat gold would be too soft for a statue of this size, Decker judged. The work was so fine that he longed to see the piece in its entirety. He scraped at the sand in which it was buried, uncovering several inches of gleaming forearm, but it was clear that to exhume the thing completely was the work of hours, if not days. As fast as he scooped out the sand, more of it subsided into the hole. Mertens was standing over him, watching. "Come on," he said. "There's more further in, and not buried so deeply." Decker stood up, brushing sand from his trouser legs. "This is astounding," he said. "A find like this belongs in a museum," finished Mertens, so ironically that Decker felt a transitory twinge of guilt. "If you want to spend the rest of your life living in a shithole and fencing amphorae to tourists, be my guest. Just make sure you sell my half of the goods before you piss yours away." "Let's go," said Decker, shortly. He had no desire to justify himself to Mertens. It would be an empty exercise anyway. Besides, the desire to know what lay further inside the cave was boiling up inside him. Rich, he thought. We're rich, both of us. The heat, the tiredness no longer held him back. He fought his way up the last part of the slope to the entrance, his arms wheeling, and stopped. What he saw there under the shadow of the great stone lintel reminded him of nothing so much as a lucky dip at a children's party. Half buried in the sandy soil were things: a bottle, a long-bladed knife, what looked like a boot. There were other things that were less easy to recognize, roughly textured objects that might have represented withered fruit or chunks of bread. All of them had that mesmerizing yellow gleam that said, "I am gold." Decker lost his head for a little while. He tried to gather these things up, all of them, though it would have been impossible for one man to carry away even a fraction of what lay half obscured by the sand. Each time he picked something up, it seemed that he saw something bigger and more valuable within an arm's reach. He dropped as much as he caught up, almost sobbing aloud in his desperation to lay hands on all of it. Mertens was a silent presence at his shoulder, watching. Decker sobered up at last, when he came upon a second statue. This time, it was not a hand that protruded from the ground. It was a golden head, shoulders, and arm. The scale of it, it would have been the same size as himself if all of it had been visible, was enough to stop him in his tracks. But what really struck him was the expression on the metal face. It was frozen in a silent scream, jaws agape, cheeks bulging, eyes squeezed into slits. Every anatomical feature, Decker noticed, was faithfully reproduced, down to a chipped tooth in the upper jaw. It was masterfully done, and chilling. "My God," he said. "What's it meant to be?" The other man shrugged, which didn't surprise Decker. Mertens knew the street value of almost everything, but had no interest in the provenance of any of it. "It might be Laocoon," Decker said, answering his own question, "or an enemy being slain in battle. It's amazingly powerful." The word sounded flat even to his own ears. Powerful didn't begin to cover what it was. Horrible might have been nearer the mark. He found himself reluctant to touch the statue in spite of its alluring golden sheen. It struck him that there would be no great pity to melt the thing down. He glanced at Mertens, standing there coolly observing him. "We can't possibly move all this in one go. We'll have to decide what to take first, test the market. Are you sure this place is safe?" Mertens nodded. "I told you, none of the locals will come here." He tilted his head to indicate that they should go further in. "You should go in and see everything. Then you can decide." Decker looked doubtfully into the interior. It was dark in there, too dark to make out very much, but Mertens had evidently prepared for this. He crossed the cave and retrieved an old-fashioned lantern, the kind Decker thought of as a camping lantern. He set it down on the ground, kneeling by it as he did so, took out a cigarette lighter and lit it carefully. Decker noticed that Mertens' right hand remained in his pocket the entire time he did this. "What's in your pocket?" he asked abruptly, and Mertens' head jerked up towards him. "My hand," said Mertens. "Why?" "Sprain." Mertens stood up, raising the lantern in his left hand. Decker opened his mouth to ask another question, but then he looked into the cave, and whatever he'd wanted to say went right out of his head. He simply gaped. From the spot where they stood, the floor sloped gradually upwards to the bottom of a flight of stone steps. The walls on either side had been carved into smooth stone panels, interspersed with tall niches, all of them empty. As the two men advanced, and the light from the lantern penetrated further into the gloom, Decker was able to make out an altar hewn out of the living rock. On it stood a figure fashioned out of the same glistening yellow metal as the objects littering the sand, but of a startlingly grotesque nature. Unlike the other statues, it wasn't life-sized. Had it been able to climb down from the altar and waddle up to Decker, the top of its head would scarcely have come up to his hip. Squat and ill-proportioned, it had a bulbous belly, a broad face surrounded with a corona of unkempt hair, and, peculiarly, the long ears of a horse. "Silenus," said Decker. He began to climb the steps. He had to see the statue close up. "This is extraordinary," he said. "I never heard of a shrine dedicated specifically to Silenus, let alone anything like this." When he became aware that Mertens was not following him, he glanced back. The other man was standing at the bottom of the flight of steps, watching him, but making no moves to follow. Well, maybe Mertens had seen the statue a dozen times before. But Decker said to himself, no one with an interest in art, even if only a commercial interest, could get tired of studying this piece. He reached the top of the steps, and now he could have put out a hand and touched the long ears or rubbed the gleaming curve of the belly. He didn't, though, not right away. He simply gazed at the statue, taking in every tiny detail. Merton's confident assertion that the place was associated with Midas made sense now. It was from Silenus that King Midas, legendarily, obtained the golden touch. Quite how this translated into an obscure cult of Silenus, into which such riches were poured, was less obvious. Perhaps, thought Decker, it was the other way round. Perhaps the cult inspired the legend. The idea was tremendously exciting, even for someone whose main interest in archaeology was financial. Apart from anything else, it increased the value of the find to a dizzying extent. He would have to consider very carefully who among his clientele had the ability to pay what this was worth, not to mention the considerable cost of an unofficial export. He turned to face Mertens boldly. "I'm in," he called down, "but I want this piece, specifically this one." Mertens gazed up at him in silence for a few moments. Then he said, "All right," speaking almost casually. Decker was momentarily taken aback, having expected more resistance. But, he reflected, there's enough gold here to make us both very rich indeed. What does he care who takes what? "We can move this now if both of us lift it," he called. He saw something pass across Merton's face, something like a flinch. Was the man balking now, when unimaginable wealth was within their grasp? But then Mertens said, "I think it's fixed to the altar. Try it." He made no attempt to ascend the steps to where Decker stood. There was a stillness about him, as though he were waiting for something. Decker looked down at him. Then he turned back to the statue and grasped it firmly by the shoulders, using both hands. Behind him he heard Mertens exhale sharply, a sound like steam escaping. If the statue moved when he applied the force of his hands, he didn't feel it. Instead he felt something so instantaneous and strange that he wondered briefly whether he'd been electrocuted, a sensation of cold and brittle tingling, as though he'd thrust his hands into a heap of metal filings. For several seconds he did not remove his hands from the statue. It wasn't that he couldn't exactly, but more that he didn't seem able to think of doing it. The skin of his hands and fingers crawled with myriad tiny pinpricks. Seconds stretched past, and then suddenly Decker seemed to snap back into normal consciousness. He pulled his hands away from the golden flesh and held them out in front of him, turning them over in confusion. What the hell just happened? He turned to Mertens and saw on the other man's face a blend of exultation and fear. Decker descended a couple of steps, hands still outstretched, and he saw Mertens take several paces backward. "Stop," said Mertens tersely, and Decker, in his confusion, actually did stop. He stood on the steps, looking at Mertens, at that strange, savage expression on the man's face. "Do you know what you've done?" asked Mertens, and Decker shook his head. "You have it now. The touch. You've got it, Decker." Decker moved restlessly and saw Mertens back away another couple of paces. He felt odd, sick, Perhaps something felt wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it. Mertens was fumbling in his breast pocket. He fished out a battered pack of cigarettes, stepped forward, watching Decker warily, and threw them up onto the steps near Decker's feet. "Pick those up," he said, "and you'll see." Decker looked at him. He was tempted to say no. It seemed a pointless thing to do. Was Mertens playing some sort of absurd practical joke on him? But then he stooped and picked up the cigarettes. He felt something then, something like the sensation he'd had when he touched the golden Silenus, except that now it seemed to be within his own flesh, a seething feeling that was right inside the epidermis. Shocked, he closed his hand involuntarily around the packet, gripping it, and then he opened it again, staring, because it didn't feel the way it should have done, not at all. Instead of shiny cardboard that gave way under the pressure of his fingers, he felt a cold, hard surface, unmistakably that of metal. Decker gazed down at the pack in his hand. Gold. He squeezed his eyes closed for a second, as though he'd had the worst migraine ever, and he opened them. The pack was still golden. "This is some trick," he said to himself. "It was already gold. He had this thing made to mess with my head." At that moment he could think of no possible reason why Mertens should have done that, but it made more sense than any other explanation. It made more sense, for example, than the idea that he himself had turned the packet of cigarettes to gold by touching it. Decker felt in his pocket. His wallet was in there, stuffed with mostly useless cards and a wad of the local banknotes. His fingers touched it, closed around it, began to draw it out of his pocket. Before he even set eyes on it, he knew that it was not the same as it had been. He had some difficulty extracting it from his pocket at all. The weave of the fabric was strangely stiff, as though it had been woven from tiny wires. The wallet itself gleamed in the lantern light, a cold yellow gleam. Decker opened it and saw that the banknotes, still separate and removable, were made of fine metal leaf. If it were gold, as it appeared to be, they were worth considerably more now than they had been before. He looked at Mertens standing below him, his posture tense as though ready for flight. "What have you done to me?" he asked. "You did it to yourself," said Mertens. "It's a shame you had to touch that thing with both hands, Decker. No," he added sharply, "don't try to come anywhere near me. Touch me, and you'll never find out how to get yourself out of this." Mertens saw that Decker had stopped and exhaled heavily. "All right, keep your distance, and I'll tell you the deal. Don't try anything. The driver knows about the Phrygian curse. If you try to go back to the jeep alone, he'll drive off without you. You'll die out here, Decker." "The Phrygian curse?" Decker shook his head, bewildered. "The Midas touch, if you prefer," said Mertens. "You poor bastard. Everything you touch is going to turn to gold." "That's not possible," said Decker. "That's not possible." He opened his hand and the gleaming wallet fell out of it onto the stone step. "It shouldn't be possible," agreed Mertens. "And yet—" he shrugged. Decker crumpled into a sitting position on the steps. "No," he said, shaking his head. He reached out and took a handful of dirt, let it fall through his fingers. As it fell, it glistened. Gold dust. He looked at Mertens piteously. Will I turn everything I touch to gold? What if I touch myself?" Mertens laughed, a short, mirthless bark. "You won't turn yourself to gold. I don't know why not, but that's not how it works. Lucky for you, because I'm not volunteering to hold your dick for you so you can piss. And it's just your hands. You can touch stuff with any other part of yourself and nothing will happen, so you can still eat, so long as you don't use fingers." Decker groaned. He took another handful of sand and another, and watched the gold dust sift through his fingers to the floor. After a while, he put his head up and looked at Mertens. "Why did you do this to me? What did I do to deserve it?" "Nothing," said Mertens. "It's not personal. There just aren't that many people I could ask to come out here. The locals are terrified of this place, and not many of the expats are as crooked as you." He made this last statement in a tone that suggested admiration, but it was lost on Decker. "Tell me how to stop it," he said. He was weeping. He believed it now utterly. "I will," Mertens promised, "but you have to do something for me first." He shrugged. "That's obvious, surely. I didn't bring you out here to torture you for the fun of it." Decker sat on the steps and watched with a haggard expression. Mertens eyed him for a moment to make sure he wasn't about to make a sudden rush, hands outstretched to use the lethal touch. Then he went to work. Evidently he'd prepared for this moment. He crisscrossed the floor efficiently, gathering bricks one-handed from caches deep in the shadowy recesses of the cabin. Soon there was a very large number of them laid out on the ground in neatly ordered rows, carefully arranged, so that there was an inch or two of clearance between them on all sides. While he worked, Mertens kept a wary eye on Decker. Men-sized statues are difficult to sell, he said, laying out another brick. Too big to transport easily and too recognizable, and, well, he tilted his head towards the spot where the golden head and arm protruded from the sand. Not everybody likes their statues screaming their heads off. Decker swallowed. That wasn't a statue, was it? Mertens didn't even bother to reply. He set out another brick. Ingots, he said conversationally. That's the most useful format, easy to move, easy to sell. Nothing to harm anyone, either, just nice, anonymous blocks of solid gold. He stood up. Right, Decker, get to work on those. Will you tell me how to stop it if I do that? When I'm ready, said Mertens coolly. We'll want more than this. There's no point in thinking small scale. It's amazing how fast a person can run through cash, and we won't get the full market value of the ingots, of course. No hallmarks. He looked Decker in the eyes, holding his gaze as though he wanted to prove his own sincerity. This will make you rich too, you know. Eventually. I wasn't lying about that. I want to stop it now. Sorry, Mertens made a rueful face. No can do. You work first and later I'll tell you. He backed away carefully and stood at a little distance. Decker got to his feet a little unsteadily. He descended the steps, stumbled, and for a moment it looked as though he would tumble down the remaining flight. Mertens made no move to catch him. After a moment Decker regained his balance and came the rest of the way down. He stood for a moment, looking at the bricks. Then he sank to his knees, putting out his hands, and got to work. It wasn't unpleasant, the sensation of turning things. The seething feeling didn't hurt. Indeed, the prickling was almost sensuous. Decker learnt as he went on that the quality of the touch affected the rate of the transformation. A firm grasp had an almost instantaneous effect, but a tentative touch with fingertips would send the change running across the brick in a wave. He worked for a long time, diligently, praying to earn his freedom. When all the bricks were gold, he looked up at Mertens, but Mertens shook his head. Not yet. I'll take as many of these as I can carry now. I'll come back tomorrow with more, and with the means to transport them out of here. And what do I do until then? Choked out Decker, desperately. You stay here tonight, you'll manage, said Mertens. It's warm enough, even at night, this time of year. The river water is clean if you want to drink, though you'll have to put your face in it. You bastard, said Decker. Sticks and stones, said Mertens. You'll thank me when we're both rich. Probably. He anticipated Decker's move and fled towards the entrance of the cave before Decker was even fully on his feet. Don't try it, he warned Decker, his chest heaving. Decker had alarmed him. If you do, we're both dead. He watched until he was sure Decker had understood that he wasn't going to make a sudden lunge, and then he turned and disappeared down the river bank as swiftly as he could. Decker's shoulders slumped. After a few moments he went to the mouth of the cave and looked out. Mertens had already reached the bottom of the slope and was retreating up the riverbed at a smart pace. Decker had rattled him. That night, as he sat shivering in the mouth of the cave, it was cool enough to be uncomfortable, whatever Mertens had said, Decker thought about laying hands on the other man. Revenge would certainly be sweet. Besides, what guarantee did he have that Mertens would help him once he'd created enough gold to fund the high life forever? Perhaps, he thought, there isn't any cure for this, and Mertens is stringing me along. I wouldn't put it past him, the bastard. He began to feel the pressing need to urinate. In spite of what Mertens had said about not turning himself into gold, the thought of touching any part of his body made him nervous. If there's a way out of this, I don't know what it is, he thought. He looked up at the night sky, at the distant stars. Nothing touched them. They kept on moving along their accustomed paths across the sky, no matter what happened down here. I suppose, thought Decker, I have to trust him. It seems insane, but then nothing that's happened since I met him in that cafe has seemed sane either. Maybe there's a chance he really does know how to stop this happening. Maybe we really will be rich, beyond our wildest dreams, living out our lives as millionaires. But he was very afraid it wasn't so. At last the pain in his distended bladder made him reckless. He had to piss. Before he did, though, he pushed back his sleeve and touched his own forearm experimentally with his fingertips. Nothing happened. I guess Mertens was telling the truth about that anyway. Decker went outside and stood a few meters away from the cave. He took a deep breath and unbuttoned himself and took out his penis. He urinated for what seemed like a long time, sighing with relief. When he did up his trousers again, the fabric had the stiff texture of woven wire, and the buttons were of gold so pure he could have scratched it with a nail. After that he lay down and did his best to sleep. In spite of the temperature and hard ground, sheer exhaustion drew him into itself. He woke after dawn and staggered, stiff-legged, to the riverbed, where he flung himself face down at the edge and put his mouth into the water. When he sat up on his heels, there were 2 hand-shaped golden marks on the gritty earth. He looked for something to eat, berries or wild grains, but found nothing. Later he defecated behind the rocks. There was no way to clean himself with his hands, so afterwards he stripped off garments that gleamed dully in the morning sun, and stood waist-deep in the river. He watched the water flowing past him. After a while he put his hands into it experimentally, and saw trails of liquid gold flowing away from him, downstream. He wept again, and in the sunshine his tears, too, were golden. Mertens came back around noon. He was accompanied by a donkey. Decker sat in the mouth of the cave and watched the 2 of them approaching, man and donkey. He felt no surprise. Nothing could be surprising any more. The donkey had probably come in the back of a pickup truck. Mertens kept a wary distance from Decker, as before. He unloaded food, some kind of stew with grains, and a battered metal spoon. He did all of this with his left hand. The right was still in his pocket. He also had bottles of soft drinks, which he opened, inserting a straw into each. Then he backed away, still eyeing Decker carefully. Decker ate with golden cutlery. Once he forgot and picked up a fallen chunk of meat with his fingers. Biting on it nearly broke his teeth. He spat gold onto the sand. While Decker ate, Mertens unloaded bricks and loaded up ingots. He glanced towards Decker so often that it began to unnerve him. Decker turned his back while he ate, to show that he meant no harm. In truth, he wasn't sure that he didn't wish Mertens harm, but he still cherished the hope that Mertens knew how to save him. After Decker had eaten, he worked as he had before, turning bricks into gold. Sometimes he looked at Mertens to see how he was reacting, whether he looked satisfied yet. He tried talking to Mertens too, persuading him. "There's enough now," he said. "There must be millions of dollars worth here. It's enough." He looked at Mertens, shaking his head, and tried again. "I don't need any of this. I don't want to be rich. If I don't take anything, we only need half as much." He stretched out his hands towards another brick, and they were trembling. "I wanted to stop, Mertens. When is it enough?" "Soon," said Mertens. "Not yet." He finished loading the donkey. He said, "Maybe tomorrow." In fact, it was 2 more nights before Mertens decided that he had enough gold. Decker was losing weight, in spite of the food Mertens brought him, and he was growing a beard. He looked hollow-eyed and wild, trembling on the brink of desperation. Probably Mertens judged that he was becoming too unpredictable, that it wasn't worth the risk of Decker touching him by accident or on purpose, not when he'd already carted away a king's ransom. He transported the last of the gold away by donkey, and then came back. He had a haversack over his shoulder, and he was carrying a machete. Decker was sitting at the mouth of the cave when Mertens came up the slope. He saw the machete and began to laugh. His laugh had a high, cracked sound, and Mertens stopped. Decker got himself under control. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Have you come to kill me?" he asked. "No," Mertens told him. "I've come to save you." He took his right hand out of his pocket. Or at least he would have done, if he'd had a hand. His right wrist terminated in a stump. It had healed over with healthy skin, but it had an ugly, gnarled look to it, as though the amputation had been inexpertly done. "This is how I save you," said Mertens. He looked at Decker, not unsympathetically. "The same way I saved myself. I had the curse too, Decker. The Midas touch. There's only one way to get rid of it." "No," said Decker, shaking his head. "There must be another way." "There isn't, believe me," said Mertens. "Do you think I would have done this to myself if there was?" "You only touched it with one hand," croaked Decker. "Yeah, it's too bad you touched it with both, but if I'd told you what would happen, you might not have touched it at all. And we need the money, don't we? Both of us." Mertens wielded the machete, swinging it through the air in an almost absent-minded way. "Anyway, they can do great things with prosthetics these days. It's not like you won't have the cash. Hell, get yourself a pair of bionic hands. You'll hardly know the difference." Decker looked at him so balefully that Mertens stopped in his tracks. The swinging motion of the machete came to a halt. "Hey," he said, "I could just have left you here. You do realize that? I still could. Try to walk out and you'll die of heat stroke, or thirst. Even supposing you made it to the nearest village, if they got a sniff of what's wrong with you, they'd beat you to death." Decker put his head in his hands. "So why did you come back?" he said. "Because I'm not a complete bastard, whatever you may think. And look, Decker, if you try anything, if you try to touch me, you'll die anyway. Think about it. If you put me out of the picture, well, you'll still have the machete. The moment you picked it up, it'd be pure gold. If it was sharp enough, you might be able to slash your skin, but you'd never get through bone with it. And supposing you did, supposing you managed to get one hand off, how are you going to do the other one?" Mertens shook his head ruefully. "No, you need me to do this for you." "He's right," Decker thought. Still he hesitated. "I'll bleed to death," he said. "Maybe that's the plan," said a voice at the back of his mind. He considered, "It would be quick anyway, quicker than dying out here in the desert." "I've got tourniquets," said Mertens, patting the haversack, "and antiseptic. It'll be as clean as I can make it." "Anesthetic?" "Ah, no." Mertens shook his head regretfully. "But I'll be quick, I promise you. I'm strong with my left hand now. I've had enough practice." "I don't really have any choice, do I?" said Decker at last. "Not really, old son." "Then let's get it over with." Mertens set up his makeshift surgical theatre on a large, flat-topped block of stone, covering it with a clean cloth. Decker watched him putting out tourniquet strips, dressings, a bottle of surgical spirit. He watched Mertens clean the machete with the spirit. He looked down at his own hands. "I'll never feel anything with these again," he said to himself. "Oh, Mertens is right about prosthetics. They can make me new hands, ones that can feed me and dress me and type letters. But I won't be able to feel with them, not properly. I'll never feel the petals of a flower again, nor blades of grass under my fingers. I'll never run my hands through a woman's hair, nor feel the softness of a woman's breast." Then he thought about what would happen if he tried to touch any of those things now, and he shuddered. Mertens took his trembling as a sign of fear. "We should do this now before you lose your nerve," he said. He nodded. "Put your right hand on that flat stone, and pull your sleeve back so I can see what I'm doing." Decker stretched out his hand, pushing back his sleeve, and laid it on the stone. The fingernails were ingrained with dirt, and the wrist looked pathetically slender. Mertens would be able to hack through it without much trouble. He might manage it in one blow, like a farmer decapitating a chicken. Would the hand still be dangerous when it was separated from its owner? That was unknown territory. Probably Mertens wouldn't want to take the risk. He might use the flat of the machete blade to swat the hand away into a dusty corner of the cave, as though it were an enormous spider. Decker's hand clenched involuntarily. He had to force himself to relax. "Get on with it," he said through gritted teeth. Mertens stepped close, so close that his shadow fell across Decker, who cringed by the stone. He raised his free hand, gripping the machete so firmly that his knuckles showed white. Decker heard him take a deep breath, tensing himself for the downward swing. That moment seemed to solidify about the two men, as though time itself had been touched by the Phrygian curse. Mertens made a sound in his throat, an abortive sound, like a strangled mew. Decker glanced up at the sound, and it seemed to him that he caught the tail end of movement as Mertens' head turned. The blond man's face contorted, the green eyes widening, the lips drawing back from the teeth. Then it froze. The blade of the machete did not descend. Mertens' shadow lying across Decker did not move and flow. Mertens' exposed skin, tanned and glistening faintly with perspiration, acquired a dull golden patina that hardened with savage swiftness into the brash gleam of solid metal. His shirt the fabric of which had been flowing with the movement of his body, froze like a photographic image, motion preserved as stillness. The shriek that would undoubtedly have issued from Merton's lips, if a few more seconds had been allowed to him, was represented instead by a curiously resonant sound, like the high note of a singing bowl. It shivered away into a silence, broken only by Decker's rapid breathing. For a moment Decker remained where he was, knees bent, one hand still outstretched on the flat-topped stone, the other encircling Merton's ankle, in the space between the top of his boot and the rumpled fabric of his trouser leg. He had touched warm bare skin. Now his fingers clasped cool, hard metal. He could feel the hairs on Merton's calf as tiny golden wires. Decker let go of Merton's with a shudder of revulsion. He got to his feet, leaning heavily on the stone for support. Even when he was upright he swayed, unsteadily. He only looked at Merton's once, at the gleaming, golden face that screamed in silent horror. Then he stumbled past him, making for the mouth of the cave, for sunshine and fresh air. There he sat down abruptly on the sandy ground, with his back to Merton's, and covered his face with his hands. "I killed someone," he said to himself, though he wasn't sure that fully encompassed what he'd done. It occurred to him that touching Merton's leg was the last time he would ever feel the warmth of anyone's skin but his own under his fingers. Decker sat there for a long time. He knew that what Merton's had said was true. When he'd ended Merton's existence, he had ended his own. Even assuming there was a driver waiting up on the bank of the river, the man would take off when he saw it was Decker who was approaching, and not Merton's. If there was an empty vehicle waiting up there, it would turn to gold the moment he touched any part of it. Pure, soft gold. Decker was no engineer, but he was fairly certain that the engine wouldn't run, and he knew what awaited him if he made it to the village. No, he thought, I'm dead too. The realization was not as frightening as he thought. Somehow, it seemed right. At last the day itself began to die. The shadows lengthened, the sun sank very low in the west, and the sky was beautifully tinted with shades of pale and glowing flame. The sunset was reflected in Decker's eyes as he watched the entire world turn to gold.